second video in my series on intervals, and so you should have watched the first video before listening to this one in order to fully understand the information contained in it, so that this will make sense. It's going to build on what we covered before. Briefly, however, I defined quantity and quality. I defined the terms unison, octave and half step, and we talked about the need for intervals to have a number and a name, or a quantity and a quality, and that intervals can be harmonic or melodic in the way that they are presented. So, having understood that information, we can now go to the next step. And the next step of understanding intervals is to identify a particular group of intervals. Once you've identified those intervals, understood how they are put together, understood how they are created, then you can use that set of intervals to identify all the other intervals that there are. So, what is this set of intervals you need to know? Well, you're going to learn the set of intervals that occur on the white notes of the piano above the note C. Here I've written out the note C and I've coloured it in a green colour, and it's consistent. And then above that you see each of the notes, the white notes of the piano, ascending, creating between each note C and the note above it an interval distance. And we are going to identify those intervals. Now, an interval is a combination, as we've said, of quantity and quality. The question is, how do you find out those? How do you find out the number for the interval? How do you then determine a quality name for it, a name that will associate with that number correctly? Well, there are two elements involved in the interval. There are the number of lines and spaces that the interval takes up on the page, and there are the number of half steps that exist between those two notes. Let's look at an example. If I take this note F, and I then look at the note A above it, I can observe that there are 3 lines and spaces involved in that interval. There is this space, this line, and this space. The interval encompasses 3 lines and spaces. So I can give it then the number 3. This must be some kind of third because it involves 3 lines and spaces. However, if I look at that interval, that's the interval from F to A, if I look at it, how many half steps are involved in that interval? Well, if I'm going to count half steps, I start on the note F and I count the half steps as I cover them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Everyone see how I did that? I started on the note F and I counted the half steps as I covered them. 1, 2, 3, 4. I obviously stop when I get to the top note of the interval, that note being A. So there are 4 half steps. So the 2 pieces of information that we can get from this interval, this F to A, we know that it is some kind of third and it has 4 half steps. Everyone, I hope, clear on how I did that. Now at this point, you can't take it any further than that until I explain a few things about the intervals we're going to look at today. But you've got to have the concept that there are 2 elements. There are the number of lines and spaces involved in the interval. That gives us a number. And then there are the number of half steps, which is ultimately going to give us a quality, but I'm going to have to explain that to you in a moment. Let's just make sure we understand that. Let's do one more to make sure we understand it. Here I'll start on the note G and I'll go to the note D. What is the number of that interval? How many lines and spaces are involved in that interval? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Counting all the lines and spaces involved, I have 5 lines and spaces. This must be some kind of fifth. How many half steps are there in that interval? Well, again, we start on the note G, we move to the note D. I start on the note G, I now move up through the half steps, counting them as I go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Again, clear on how I did that. Start on the note G, count the half steps as I go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 half steps here. You have to be able to gather those two pieces of information in order to identify any interval. Initially, I'm going to use those pieces of information to give you a set of intervals that you will just know. Then you can use those intervals to figure out whether the notes you're trying to work out, the intervals you're trying to work out, are the same as the ones you know or are different. And depending on how different they are, you'll be able to give them a name as well. So, here is our first set of intervals. Now, we could go through this and kind of figure all this out, but I'm going to talk through it fairly quickly, and you'll need to maybe come back to this a few times to really get it. But all I am doing with these intervals here is exactly what I did up here with the intervals we just looked at. I'm going to identify the number of lines and spaces involved, and I'm going to identify the number of half steps involved. So the number of lines and spaces is going to go under here, the number of half steps will go above. So, this first one, the number of lines and spaces, 1 line or space is used. So it is called a unison. In this case, 2 lines and spaces, some kind of seconds. 3 lines and spaces, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8, which we will refer to as an octave. I hope that makes sense. All I did was count the number of lines and spaces involved in the intervals C to D, C to E, C to F, C to G, all the way up. Counting the lines and spaces gave me a unison, a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, and an eighth. Now, what about the number of half steps? Well, if I were to count the number of half steps in a unison, I would find that from starting on the note C and going to the note C, no half steps are involved. I haven't moved anywhere. So 0 half steps in a unison. In a second, if I start on C and I'm going to D and I count the half steps as I go, 1, 2, 2 half steps. I could go on doing that up all of the various intervals, C to D, C to E, C to F. What I would find is that between C and E there are 4, between C and F there are 5, between C and G there are 7, between C and A there are 9, between C and B there are 11, between C and C there are 12 half steps. Counting half steps, simply doing exactly the same way as I did before. So we have 0 half steps in a unison. We have 2 half steps in this particular second. Not all seconds, this particular one. I'm going to give you a specific name for it in a moment. And so on through the rest of these. So what are the specific names for intervals that have this particular criteria? Well, they are as follows. We call this a perfect unison. It is a major second, a major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and a perfect octave. So putting this another way, if I have an interval where 2 notes are a fifth apart, that is to say there's a total number of lines and spaces involved, that equals 5, that's a fifth, and if when I count up the half steps there are 7 half steps, then it must be a perfect fifth. Let me say that again with another interval, just so we can be clear. Let's take the third. If I have an interval where the 2 notes involved are a third apart, there are 3 lines and spaces involved in the interval when you write it out. If there's 3 lines and spaces involved, and when I count the number of half steps, there are 4 half steps, then that interval must be a major third. The definition of a major third is that it is a third on paper. There are 3 lines and spaces used on paper, and that it has 4 half steps. That is the definition of a major third. So what I can do now is I can say, okay, let's look at some intervals and let's see if we can identify them on this particular set of intervals. So let's take the interval F to C. First thing I do, count up the total number of lines and spaces. Get myself the number that I need. Total number of lines and spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is some kind of fifth. Now I count up the total number of half steps. How many half steps between F and C? Well, I go over here and I identify F and C, and I count up the number of half steps. Starting on F, I count the half steps as I go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 half steps. There are 7 half steps. So I know that this interval is some kind of fifth and it has 7 half steps. If I go back to here, I know that the fifth that I have has 7 half steps. This is a perfect fifth, so this must also be a perfect fifth. It has all the characteristics of a perfect fifth. It is a fifth on paper, 5 lines and spaces. It has 7 half steps. That makes it a perfect fifth. What I want you to do is to try this with other intervals, and sometimes you'll find that the interval, you can get the correct number, you know that you have a sixth, but that it has more or less half steps. That's fine. The next video is going to tell you how to name the intervals that have more or less half steps. But for now, what you need to be able to identify is, first of all, obviously be able to count and get a number. Make sure you can count a third or a fifth or a second or whatever it might be. And then make sure you can count accurately the number of half steps. If the half steps match this set of intervals, then you have a match. You can call your interval, wherever it might have started or finished, whatever notes might be involved. If it has the same criteria, then it must also be a major third, a major second, whatever it might be. However, if it has a different number of half steps, then we'll need to go on to the next video to figure out what we do at that point. Practice this, make sure you're clear on this. If you have any questions, you can bring your questions to class. Otherwise, go ahead and make sure you understand this, and then go on to the next video to be able to understand how to identify intervals that are not perfect or major. You should learn this set of intervals. You should learn that a perfect fourth has 5 half steps. That you need to know. That a major sixth has 9 half steps. Learn that, and that will make it a lot easier to figure everything else out around it. Thank you very much.